Hey everyone, welcome to the first ever episode of Firebase Semi-live, the live coding show where I live code it right here, but you watch it not live out there. So today we are going to take on the topic of building blog comments with Firestore and serving the site on Firebase Hosting. So the site I want to build, I want it to be a static blog, but I want the comments to be dynamic. And the goal is that the page needs to be able to load quickly. So let's take a look at this blog. So you can see right here, it's just a really basic blog that I built very quickly. And then down here, I have this button called Load Comments. So the idea is that all we have to do is load the static HTML first and the CSS. And then when I'm ready to actually load the Firestore comments, I just have that be clicked on by the user and it pops up lazily. So let's take a crack at building this. So in my editor, I have a Webpack set up right here. And I'm also using Tailwind CSS to build out all my CSS, which is really cool. You should check it out. But we're going to be mostly focusing on Firebase stuff today, obviously. And the idea is I want to use Webpack's chunking or code splitting ability so I don't have to load Firebase or Firestore right away. But I want to start by building it the naive way. I want to build it in a way where we do have to load Firestore before we load everything else, just so we can see how to improve it and how we can work from that base situation. So in this page, actually, in my blog with this little icon, I want to animate these because I want to show what happens to other JavaScript on the page if you're not lazily loading things. So I'm going to animate these, and these should show up immediately on page load, but it's not going to be that great at first. So I'm not going to use a JavaScript framework or anything. I'm just going to use basic JavaScript. So I'm going to use a class called comments, and I'm going to kind of do everything inside of this class. And if you haven't noticed, I'm also using TypeScript, which is very similar to JavaScript, just has types. So if you're not familiar with it, don't worry, don't let it trip you up. It's nothing too crazy. So what I want to do is I want to be able to get a hold of some DOM elements so I can animate. So I'll grab the DOM elements and then I'll run the animations, and I'll use some CSS classes for that. So right here, I have this header, and we can see we have an H2 of blog title of my blog, and then we also have the image ID of logo. So these are the two ones I want to animate. So I'll make sure to get them with the query selector. So with TypeScript, you actually can put properties on your classes. So I'll have one for logo, and I can say that's an HTML image element, and it's going to give me an error because I haven't initialized it to anything yet. And then I also want my blog title, which is an HTML div element. I'm going to double check that. It's an H2. So let's change that. It's HTML is a heading element. And then now we'll use our trusty query selector. So document.query selector. And so hashtag logo. And then you can see this is actually causing an error because TypeScript returns back, element, I think. So HTML image element or null is not assignable to, because I think I need to, I think I need to say as HTML image element. Yep, stop screaming. I'm happy about that. So now it's in my blog title. So document.query selector of hashtag blog title. And then that too as HTML heading element. Okay, cool. So now I run animations. So what I want to do is I want to just add some classes. So I'll call a method called run, or I call it animate header. So I'll create that method down here. And this is going to be just two simple lines of code, this .logo, .class list. So add fade in up. So that'll just kind of go from a 0 opacity and translate the Y axis. And then this .blog title, .class list, .add fade in down. And the last bit, so this actually runs, is I want to say new comments. All right. So this will create a new class, which will run this constructor, and you can see we'll call this code. So at this point, I need to serve. So I'm actually going to set up Firebase Hosting to use it for local serving. And I'm actually not going to set it up the way that you've probably used it before, because that wouldn't be fun. We want to do things a little differently. So I'm going to set it up by hand so you can see all the work that the CLI is actually doing for you underneath the hood. And this is actually how I set it up in all my projects, because I have so many projects that like the list is so massive that it'd take me longer to find my project in the list than it would be for me to just set it up here in the project. So there's two files that are important for Firebase Hosting, and really just two files alone. That's Firebase RC, so it's .firebase RC. You can see that VS Code gives us a nice little icon with it, so that's like a really good way of knowing that you typed it in right. And then there's also Firebase.json, which we also get the nice little icon for. So with Firebase RC, this is how you configure which projects you're going to deploy to. So in this case, I can write projects, and then I start with a default project. So you should always have a default project to deploy to. And in this case, I think I call it Fire Semi-live, or maybe it's Fire Semi-live. I can't really remember. Let me check the console. Which way's the console? I called it Fire Semi-live, so I'm going to copy that. I did get it right. Nice. But the cool thing about this is just one type of project you could have. You could have multiple. You could have a staging alias, and you could have a production alias, or just a whatever. You can keep going on this, and then in the command line to switch, you would just say Firebase use and staging, or whatever the name of this key is, and then that way you can deploy out to that after you use that. So it's a nice little way to manage multiple environments. But in this case, I just have my default project. And this is used by default, so I don't have to say Firebase use default in this case. So the second is Firebase.json. And Firebase.json actually manages more than just hosting. Firebase.json can manage deploying your database rules, your storage rules. It can manage your Firestore rules. It does a lot of really cool things. And so what we're going to use it for primarily right now is with hosting. So we'll give it a hosting key because that's the product we're using. And then the main thing you have to tell it is what folder do you want to deploy files from? And we refer to this as the public folder. So you say the public folder is, and in this case, I'm actually using this dist folder. So I'll say public is dist. And there's also lots of other cool things we can do in this hosting directory. We can set custom headers. So you can do like HTTP2 push headers. We can do redirects and rewrites. And rewrites is how we mix with Firebase, with Cloud Functions. So there's lots of cool stuff we can do. We also can say ignore. So if there's anything in your directory that you don't want to deploy, that works out really well. And I like to do this for like node modules or something like that, so I don't accidentally deploy all my node modules. But for now, I'm just gonna leave it at this. And with this set up, I should be able to come down into my command line, and I'm actually gonna tap into my node modules because I installed this locally, .bin Firebase serve. And with any luck, it's serving here on localhost 5000. So if I refresh, yay, we're up and running. All right, so this is up and running. That's great. And I also have, cut that one out. That should be gone. I don't know why that's still running. But we also have Webpack running on a watch command. So basically when you type webpack -- watch, Webpack's just going to keep running after any changes. So every time I make a change here, it'll just automatically recompile, and we'll just be able to refresh it in the browser, which is pretty nifty. All right, so now when I refresh, we see we have our animations. So that's cool. We have something that we'll be able to be slowed down by including too much JavaScript on the page. So now to the Firebase part. So to import Firebase from module syntax, we want to import Firebase /app. So this means we're just going to import the Firebase app library. We don't want to import all of Firebase. We just want to import what we're using. So in this case, we're going to start by importing app and say star as Firebase because that's how TypeScript likes it. And then I'm going to import just Firebase/Firestore because that's my main feature. All right. So in this case now, I have included Firestore, and what I want to do is I want to be able to configure a Firebase app, and I'm going to do it inside of this constructor actually. So I'm going to create an interface, call it comments config, and what I want is an auth domain, which is a string, and then also I need a project ID, which is what Firestore needs, which is a string. So the constructor of this will take in a config, which is a comments config. And then from here, we can create a Firebase app as a property, which is firebase.app.app. And then we'll also create a comments reference from Firestore. So the type is located at firebase.firestore.collection reference. So let's appease TypeScript by actually initializing these properties. And to do that, I'll say this.firebase app is firebase.initialize app, and I'm going to do it actually with this config. And then now that I have a Firebase app, I can create my comments reference. And something I really want to point out right here is that there's two ways of using Firebase apps. You can either create firebase.initialize app and return an app from the function, or you can just call firebase.initialize app and then sort of globally, in a way, you can say firebase.firestore or whatever features you've initialized. And when you do it this sort of global way, it works off of the default app. And this is like a really nice and easy way to do it. But honestly, I really prefer returning it through a Firebase app, because if you ever try to unit test your app, or if you want to be able to run a different app, or you want to be able to run your different project, that is, it's much easier if you can pass that app in as a parameter rather than relying on that default app. So this is just something that is pretty easy to do, and it makes your life easier when you want to switch projects or port your code somewhere else. So I really recommend returning the Firebase app. So now that I have that created, we'll create the comments reference from Firestore. And I guess before I should do that, we should kind of talk how we want to store these comments in the database. So with Firestore, everything is collections and then documents. So you have a collection is just a list of documents. So in this case, it's a blog, so I'll have a collection of articles. And then each article will be a single document. So in this case, we'll have a key or an ID of each document. And so I'll just call this one article 1, but ideally I'd want that to be some unique article or some unique ID, or maybe the URL of the page, something that I know I can key off of. So this document would be article data. So maybe it would have like the article title, the author, or whatever pertinent information. This is something that we're not really going to be doing right now in this specific video, but what we care about are the comments. So Firestore has this concept of sub-collections, and that's a collection at the same path of a document. It doesn't particularly belong to the document, so if you read the document, you're not going to pull back all the sub-collection data, but they share the same path, which makes it really easy to organize, it makes it easy to organize your data structure. So the way we're going to read comments is through articles, the article key or ID, and then the comments subcollection. So I'm going to do that now. I'll say this.commentsRef is this.firebase app.firestore.collection of articles. And let me put this on a separate line so it's easier to read. So .collection of articles actually, instead of saying .collection of articles, well, I guess you could do it two ways. You could say .collection of articles, .doc of article 1, .collection. Where is that? VS Code doesn't want to find the right type here. Sometimes if I just keep hitting dot it will listen to me. Why won't you? There it is. Dot collection of comments. So I could do it this way and just keep chaining, or I could do it like this. Dot collection of articles, article 1 comments. So whatever way you prefer. I prefer kind of doing the chaining because it just feels like it's easier to maintain than just one string, but you know, whatever is your preferred method is totally fine. So now we have these comments. And what we want to do, if we look at the page, is that we're going to add an event listener to this button. And when we click, we're just going to read back all the comments. And so right now there aren't any comments in the database, so we will seed them after we write this code. So what we need to do is we need to get more DOM elements. And in this case, if we go to the HTML, we can see that the button ID for load comments is called load comments. It's pretty easy to remember. So we'll create our button property, which is an HTML button element. And we'll say this dot load comments is document dot query selector of hashtag load comments as HTML button element. And if there's any like super advanced TypeScript user out there watching this telling me, hey, you don't have to do this as thing, let me know, because I would like not to do that. It's a big pain of mine. All right. So now that we have this button, we're going to we'll call a method called this dot add listeners. This is a good place to add listeners. So I'll create a method add listeners. So that's now happy. And what we'll do is we'll say this dot load comments dot add event listener of a click. I'll name it the full thing, event. So whenever someone clicks, we're going to want to tap into this reference and we're going to want to stream back comments. But we're also going to want to take this button and make it go away, because if they've clicked on it, it's going to load. You know, the button doesn't need to appear anymore. But we will only do that after the data has appeared. Actually, now that I think about it, we should probably take it away immediately, because if you click on it and nothing has happened yet because it's downloading over the network, you might just keep clicking on it because you're like, why isn't anything happening? And if you're on a slow connection and you got a really click happy user, that could be bad. So let's remove the element immediately. And so to do that, I'll say this dot load comments dot class list dot add, and then I have one called hidden, which sets its display to none. All right, now let's run that real quick. Oh yes, of course, that's going to break at times. And so let's refresh. And if I click load comments, it doesn't like it. Must provide project ID. Oh, that's interesting. I thought I am providing project ID. No, I'm not actually passing any of that information I said I would pass. All right, let's do that. So we parameterize this constructor to take in config, but I actually didn't pass any of the config in, so that's going to be a problem. So fire semi-live dot Firebase app.com, and then project ID is fire semi-live. Okay, now it's happy. And so what's really important to understand right here is that whenever you create a Firebase app, a lot of your configuration details are going to be based off of your project ID. So in this case for auth domain, I always know it's the project ID.firebaseapp.com. Same thing if you use storage, your bucket is your project name.appspot.com. So it's just kind of good stuff to know so you can do really quick configurations. All right, so let's refresh the page, just get out of phone mode. And if I click the button, it disappears. So I think we're done here. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so this is an error that you get from Firestore right now because we're changing the way that the date object is stored. So we're using this timestamps, server timestamps instead of native JavaScript date objects. So if you don't want to see this error, it's actually pretty simple to configure that. So let's do that really quick. And so to do that, where am I creating my Firestore? Right here. Say this dot Firebase app.firestore, and I can say the settings, timestamp and snapshots is true. So that built, and if I refresh, it's gone. All right, so let's keep moving along. So now that we have this comments reference, we add the listener, we need to start streaming back the data. So with Firestore, we have real-time data listeners through the onSnapshot method. So with the comments ref, I can say this.commentsref.onSnapshot provide me a callback. So in this case, I can say here's the snapshot, and then inside of here is where I can do any rendering. So one thing I want to do is I want to kind of have this render method, and within here I can pass in the data that I need to render. And you might be thinking like that looks kind of like React. Well, it's kind of a nice methodology to do it this way because a lot of people are familiar with this render method, and since this is just a regular class that doesn't have any opinions of how to do things, I kind of try to use things that seem familiar. So in this case, I'm going to provide a little render method just so if someone else came and took a look at my code, they would say, hey, that's probably where the render is. So that's just something that I decided to do. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to take these comments or the snapshots and I want to turn them into actual comment objects. So to do that, what I'll need to do is take a look at the snapshot type actually. So we'll click into snapshot. Why are you not working with me? So if I say snapshot is declared is a Firestore, usually VS Code when you click into this does it, so we'll do it a different way. So snapshot dot will tell us all of the properties or functions that are on the snapshot. And you can see we have a couple things that we can call. There's doc changes, and doc changes will return to an array of, well, document changes. But that means it's not the actual sorted information or your state of your collection, it's what happened. So if something was deleted, you would get an emission of a doc change saying like, hey, this was deleted. And then you could use that to toast a little pop-up that was like, this got deleted, or do an animation based on that. So these are actual events that happen in your app. And then we have docs. Docs is the actual state of your application. So in this case, for my comments, it is the actual list of comments. So if something is deleted, that docs will have that removed, whereas doc changes will be that actual document that was removed. And then there's testing for empty. There's a for each method to loop through things is equal. We can check out some metadata, which is useful if you're doing offline changes. The query is the underlying reference, and then the size, so how many documents are in the snapshot. So docs comes back as an array. So one thing that I can do is I can actually map over it. So in this case, I can return it. And then doc has a couple of properties itself. It has data, which will return you the JSON representation, or the JSON object, that is, not the string form. You can check to see if it exists, which is a nice, helpful method. There's get, which is a promise of getting the data because it's also shares the same as the reference. We can see the ID. We can check to see if something is equal. We can see metadata, and then also get the underlying reference, which is helpful if you want to do any mutation operations like set, update, delete. So in this case, I just want to map the data over. And actually, one thing the data will do is it'll just return you the data. But as you can see, the ID is on the document, not the data itself. So right here, this is sort of a, whatever you want to do kind of thing. You can either store the ID in the document itself, so that way you don't have to worry about getting it from the SDK through this mapping method, or you can just do it like this, where you say, okay, let's return the ID. So it's doc.id, and then mix that in with the actual object. So in this case, this will be all of our comments. Let's bring that out to a separate line. So now our comments is going to be an array, and it's going to have an ID and then other properties that come down from the server. And from here, I can call this dot render with my comments. So this isn't going to do anything. I just want to console.log my comments. Make sure that rebuilt. Do a refresh. So we didn't get anything, and it's probably because we did not. Yes, well, we did call add listeners. So let's do some debugging. See what I missed. All right, so I don't want this file. I want this. So this is my TypeScript file, which is using a source map, so it looks the same in the browser than it does in my editor. And what I want to do is I want to add a breakpoint at add listeners and then inside, and just kind of refresh and see what happens. So it calls add listeners, and oh, because I have to click the button. That is why. It's the whole point of this. So I click the button, and the button goes away, so that's good. And then we're going to call on snapshot, and I'm going to wait, and then we get this message that says could not reach Cloud Firestore backend, connection failed 2 times, most recent error is this and that. And that's because I just recently created this project right before I started. Like right before I started. So what I didn't do was I didn't go into the console and enabled my Firestore, because that way you only want to create these resources if you need them. So I'm going to quickly go in and create that. All right, so I'm in my console, and as you can see, I have everything up and running now. And just as a note, I started in test mode. And so that means everyone has read and write access to my rules, which is bad, which is very bad. Not so bad while you're developing, but it's nothing that you should ever go to production in. So if you're gonna deploy this database out to production, you need to write rules. And we're not gonna cover that in this video, but I plan on covering it in the very next one. So it's gonna have its whole video dedicated to doing this. But for now, we're just gonna get things up and running. So I wanna add a collection. We're going to have articles, and we're going to have article _1, and then field, we'll just call it name, some article, and then I will save. So now I want to add a sub collection. So in this case, this article 1 is going to have comments, and then we'll have an auto ID here, and we'll say the text is first, because that's what every comment ever is. All right, so I'll save. And then look at that. All this stuff just went crazy. We got, in the good way, we got our sub collection with our data, and Firestore responded immediately. And we can see if we finish mapping right here, we just get rid of these breakpoints. If you go down, I'll get rid of this error message. You can see that we got an empty emission at first, and we got that when we actually enabled our API, and then we got this other one was when we added our data. So now that we have these comments, let's actually try to render them. So to render them, I want to create a div with the class of comments, and then it just has a p tag. That's going to be something simple for now, and probably the next video when we do security, I'm going to do authentication as well, and so we'll be able to kind of display a user avatar or something like that. But for now, let's just get it so it's displaying text. So to do that, I want to be able to create a method called like create comment or something like that, or actually even better, what if we just create a class called comment? So comments is the actual comment list. So I could probably call it comment list instead of comments. That actually sounds way better. So I'll rename that symbol, comment list. And that didn't work out super well. So comment list, new comment list. Okay, and then we'll have a single comment. And so for this, we'll say the constructor of comment, and we could pass in some data or something. But really all I want to do, now that I think about it, is just do one where it's like create or something like that. Actually, you know what? We'll just make it a function. We'll get to that later. I was trying to build into some custom elements, which you'll see in a future video. So we'll create a comment. So create comment. And this will take in a comment, which right now we'll just type to any. So I'll create the parent div. So that's document.create element div. Take the div and class list.add and we will add the class of comment. And then we will create a p tag. So document.create element of p tag. Actually, it really bothers me not to have my variable initialization statements next to each other. And then we'll say p.textContent equals comment.text. And then lastly, we'll take the div and append the p and return the div. All right. So now what we want to do here, we'll say create the actual elements. So we'll create const fragment is document.create document fragment. So if you're not familiar with document fragments, they're a really good and efficient way of updating the DOM. And they are a detached fragment of elements where you can append children to, modify them, and once you're ready to insert it into the DOM somewhere, you can just append the fragment. So it's a really nice way of, nice performant way of doing DOM insertions. So what I can do is I can loop through my comments and say comment.for each comment. And inside of here, I can create a comment or comment elements. So say const element is this.create comment. And I'll pass in the comment. And then I can call the fragment and say fragment.append child comment. And then the last step of render is I want to go to this comment placeholder, which is sort of the container for all the comments. And I want to create a property for it so I can append to it. So the comment placeholder is HTML div element. That's right, it's a div. And then right here, say this dot comment placeholder is document.query selector hashtag comment placeholder as HTML div element. All right, so now that we have that, we can append to it. So we have created our fragment, and we'll say this dot comment placeholder dot append child of fragment. All right, no errors, no errors. Let's refresh. Let's go and click the button, and we got an error message, and it says failed to execute append child on node parameter 1 is not type of node. And that's because I'm adding the wrong one. And VS Code screamed at me and tried to let me know that too by having that element be dim, so I should have caught that. And because I typed this as any, the fragment was able to do that. So I just really set myself up for this one. So now if I refresh, click the button, we have our comment. So this seems really cool. If we created a comment form, which we will in the next video, we could start adding a lot of comments and everything. But what I want to showcase right now is while this works, we're not doing things in the most performant way. So let's prove that. So I'm going to shut down the watch, and I'm going to shut down my Firebase server. All right, so now we want to go and deploy. So to do that, I'm going to go into my node modules, 'cause that's where my Firebase CLI is locally located, and do a Firebase deploy. So it's gonna go out to the project, it's uploaded successfully, and we can just go out to this URL. And we have our little animation run. Reload comments. There we go. But I want to prove to you that we're not doing things as performantly as we could. So let's take a look at a few things here. I'm going to open up the network tab, and I'm going to refresh. And we can see if we go to all that we are loading 4 assets, which is really small. So that's cool. But as you can see right here, it's 2.4 megabytes of JavaScript, which is crazy, but that's because I'm also deploying all of my source maps, which are crazy heavy. So I need to go actually and do a production deploy. So now what I want to do is I want to go in my Webpack config and change development into production. And I'm pretty sure that there's a flag to do this. And so if you know that, just leave it down in the comments. But right now I don't know it off the top of my head. And so what I want to do is I want to build, so I'll say yarn build, because that's where my Webpack build is aliased to. And so now it's going to go through and it's going to take a little bit because the production builds are a little more intensive. Oh, and it's going to give me some, it's giving me some problems saying that this is really big. And oh, it's because I'm still inlining the source map. All right, so let's just comment that out for now. And if there's also a way to do this without commenting it out, let me know in the comments. So let's run that again. Make sure that I'm not still including source maps somewhere. Okay. All right, so Webpack's giving us some warning, an asset size limit, and I will cover that in a little bit. So now that we have something less than 2.4 megabytes built, I want to go deploy it again. Node modules.bin Firebase deploy. All right, so refresh. And we can see right here that this is a little smaller in the fact that it's 94 kilobytes. So that's all of this Webpack code. That's all the Firestore code and all of our app code. And right now we don't see any problems, but this is a pretty good connection. So let's see where this can be an issue. So I'm going to go to a site called webpagetest.org. So here I'm at webpagetest.org, and one of the things you can do here is you can enter in a URL and then set how you want to test it with all these crazy options. But it can kind of feel overwhelming. So there's actually a page on the site you can use called Easy Mode. So all you do is paste in the URL that you want to use, and then you just start the test. Now, this can take a little bit, depends on how many people are using this service, how long it takes to run the site. In this case, I'm hoping that doesn't take too long. So while this is working on it, I'm gonna fill the time because otherwise it could be sitting here for a minute or two. So what I want to do is I'm trying to showcase that when we're doing these two imports here at the top, these have to run before all this other code does. And what I'm really trying to show here is that this animation isn't going to happen until this code is executed. And if you think about it, that doesn't really make sense. Like, I should be able to run my animation before my comments are loaded, because my comments don't have to be loaded until I click that load comments button. So what I want to do is I just don't want these imports at the top level. I want to do them dynamically. And so the way that Webpack lets you do that is through this dynamic import function where you can say import Firebase/app, and then it returns it as a promise. And so inside of that promise, we have access to the Firebase module, but what's great is that it's not in our critical path. And Webpack actually goes out and splits that into a separate file. And that file is only loaded when we click that button. So let's go down here to the add listeners. And what we want to do is when it's clicked, we want to import Firebase/app. And then we could do this through an async await. So I'll say const app is Firebase, import Firebase app. Sorry, Firebase. And then we could await Firestore as well. Await import Firebase/Firestore. And this is giving me an error because there's some issues with it right now in the package. This is a little bug that we need to fix. So I'm going to hack into my node modules to fix this really quick. And it's not a good solution, but it will work. And this is something that we'll probably have fixed by the time this project goes out. So if I go into the node modules, follow my alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, Firebase, and then go into Firestore and go to package.json. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a typings folder, and I'm going to say it's /index.dts. I think that will do it. And then I'll restart the TS server. And then here in a second, it should stop complaining. Awesome. Okay, so you shouldn't have to do that. But this is basically what I did is that we have some misconfiguration in the, or we don't have it perfectly set up for these dynamic import types. And so I'm basically tricking TypeScript, but it's not really of any consequence because we're not importing any types from this. All the types come from the top level Firebase. So it's just something that we need to tweak. So now that we have Firebase loaded, we can actually see something pretty interesting here. If we do a yarn watch to start rebuilding our Webpack. Webpack is watching the files. I gotta save, I think, to trigger it. There we go. And we can see that now we have a 0.bundle, a bundle, a 2 bundle, a 3 bundle. And those are actually the asynchronous chunks. So all of our code's not just in one bundle. We only will get those pieces of code when we click that button. So to prove this, I gotta run the server. Let's do that really quick. Modules.bin Firebase serve. Let's refresh, and we're getting an error about Firebase not being defined. Let's see why that is. Format, so it's hard to, oh yes, because we haven't refactored our code all the way yet. So that's kind of why we still have some TypeScript errors, we have some issues, but we'll fix that here in a second. But let's take a look at the page load. So we can see here that our first view comes in 4 seconds, and this is on a slow 3G connection. And the load time is 6.5 seconds. So that, and then this first view is at 6.5 seconds and 6.2. So there's some variations because it's a mobile network. So let's do this middle one. So we go to the film strip view, and I can see that at 4 seconds, the page was first loaded. And what I want to do actually is I want to check out fully loaded, and I want to create a video of this, which is also going to take a second. And what I want to show is that animation just sat there, and it couldn't actually happen until Firebase loaded. And so when we split it out, that animation will be able to load. So 4 seconds, and there it is. See, look, right here, the animation didn't run. It just sat there, and then it ran around 6.3, 6.2 seconds. And if we look back, that should be, yep, like I thought, that's exactly when our bundle kind of ran and then executed. So all of our JavaScript had to be downloaded for our animations to run, which is, which shouldn't be the case. So that's what we're fixing now. So let's go back here and let's figure out what's going on. So we have this Firebase, and so all this, why is TypeScript not working right now? But basically all this code isn't going to work, and that's because that's because we're loading it asynchronously now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy it right here, and we're going to paste it right in here. And so the config now we need to create as let's create a private property, and they want it to be in the constructor. So we're going to get rid of that because it no longer will be a property since it's being asynchronously loaded, but there's some cool stuff we can do with observables for that. So we'll turn these into variables for now. And say, and then, all right, and we look, everything looks fine now. So let's refresh it. Let's check out our build. There it is. All right, so now let's go back to this, let's refresh. And actually, I want to go back to using the development build so I can read the code and have source maps. Let's refresh. Oh, I need to wait till it rebuilds. So let's just run a save so it does its thing. Gonna build. Okay, why aren't you building? So Webpack is betraying me. So I'm just gonna run the watch command again. All right, so now refresh. We have our source maps back. And what we can see right here, if we go into the network, is that we just have this bundle JS, but it's even with source maps, this bundle is 27 kilobytes, which if we got rid of source maps, if we minified it and compressed it, it would probably only be a couple of bytes, which is really great. And if we refresh, we can see it's still the same. And now when I click this load comments, we get 0 bundle, 1 bundle, 2 bundle. This is all these async chunks that we're loading. And then our comment comes in. So now I'm going to go back and do a production build again and deploy and test on Webpage test. So do node modules .bin Firebase deploy. So I'm going to go back to Webpage test, and actually what I'm going to do right now is just go back to Webpage test /easy. And start test. So this is going to take another minute or so. Basically what we were able to do is, if you look, we have 9 kilobytes for this bundle. So in 9 kilobytes, which still seems pretty heavy. Oh, it's because we did not minify it. So if we minified it, it would be much smaller. And it's still including source maps. So that also, so I think to not include source maps, I not only have to comment out this, but I need to go into my tsconfig and say source map false. But still, this would be under, I think this would be a couple of bytes if we didn't have source maps and if it was minified. And so, but we're including much less. And then when we click the button, then these things come into play. And so what's great is that we are optimizing for our page load. And then other things that are heavier, like Firestore, we can then decide that we're going to load them only when they're needed. And so in this dynamic way. And there's actually ways we can make this really fast too, which we'll cover in a future video when we make things more performant. But what we can do is we can actually use a attribute call or a tag called link-rel preload, which will preload it in the background while the user's reading the blog post. And so when they click on it, it will be loaded and it'll be lightning fast. And you could do something similar to with a service worker. So, all right, so we can see that our first view is 4.5 seconds, 4.8, which isn't all that different than before. But that's because it's our animation that we are worried about. And we can see right here our bundle ran at about 3.3 seconds. And if we would have actually removed the source maps, it would have been way faster. So let's go and do a fully loaded and create video. So this is going to take just about a second to load. So now that's loaded. Let's take a look. We scrub through. Then at about, let's see here, 4.3. And you look at that. As it loads, our animation runs immediately. So it means we're no longer waiting on any other JavaScript to do that. Our animation just goes. All right, I think that's a good cutoff point for now. In the next video, we're going to get the source maps out when we deploy so we can see get faster there. We'll do the stuff with the preloading to get it really quick. But what I also want to do is I want to clean up some of this code, because if we look at this asynchronous part, it's kind of a mess. We have this async click, and then we have an async import, another async import, and then we have another async snapshot. There's a lot of async stuff going on. And so I'm a huge fan of RxJS, and I would like to use RxJS to sort of simplify this into one pipeline, and then also use security rules to get this more secure since it's not just open, and then create a comment form based on that so we can add more comments, authenticate people, and make it secure. So thank you for coming out to the very first episode of Firebase Semi-live, the live coding show where I live code right here and you don't watch it live out there. If you have any comments of things you want us to cover in the future, just leave that and make sure to subscribe for any future videos. And I will see you in the next episode.